Good evening, friends. Tonight we are going back to Victorian Britain. We are not going to talk about the Queen, wars, or grand history. We are simply going to take a look at what the British of that era actually had to eat on their tables. Now, dim the lights, and let the sound of the clock lead you into tonight's story. You are floating above London in the middle of the 19th century. Night has fallen, and the gas lamps bloom into rings of dim yellow light in the damp fog. Your gaze passes through the rooftops and first lands in a crowded, gloomy room. This is a bedroom, a sitting room, and a kitchen all at once. In the fireplace at the center of the room, a weak flame lights the faces of a family. They are gathered around a rough wooden table, eating their dinner. You lean closer. The air is thick with the smell of onions. There are no plates on the table. Each person is holding a large piece of bread. The bread is very dark in color. Solid, coarse brown household bread. It fills the stomach, and it is their most important source of calories. The children dip their bread into something in a small bowl. It is not butter, but dripping the animal fat that drips down while meat is roasting. For families who cannot afford butter, this is a rare delicacy and a valuable source of energy. In the middle of the table sits a pot containing today's main dish, vegetable soup, or, more accurately, vegetable mush. Bubbling inside are the cheapest vegetables they can find: carrots, something stringless, and huge amounts of onions. In Victorian London, onions were a godsend for the poor. For half a penny you could buy a dozen, so they appeared in almost every dish, roasted, fried, stewed, everywhere. As for meat, that was a luxury. Perhaps only on Sundays could they get a small portion of pig's cheek stewed until tender, or some shin of beef. That would count as a feast. For poorer families still, dinner might be heartbreakingly simple. Just a slice of bread with a few sprigs of tender but almost calorie-free watercress. This was a typical Victorian working-class table. Simple, repetitive, everything directed toward a single fundamental aim: survival. Now let us shift our gaze away from this dim district and drift westward to London's West End. Here the streets are broad and bright, and the gas lamps themselves seem to shine more brilliantly. You choose a tall terrace house at random, pass through heavy curtains, and enter a dining room ablaze with light. A long table is spread with a snow-white cloth. Silverware and crystal glasses glitter. It is the same family meal, yet the scene before you might as well belong to another planet. Here dinner is not a single pot of vegetable mush, but a long, highly ritualized performance. The first thing brought in is a bowl of soup. This is not ordinary vegetable soup, but one of the greatest luxuries of the age: turtle soup. This dish was a symbol of wealth and status, enjoyed only by the richest households. Of course, the rising middle class, unable to afford real turtle, invented a substitute: mock turtle soup. They used calf's head and feet to imitate the texture and flavor of turtle, and the dish became astonishingly popular, so popular that it even appeared in Alice in Wonderland, which gives you some sense of its fame. When the soup is finished, servants silently remove the tableware and replace it with fresh settings. Next comes fish, then the main course, usually some astonishingly large roast, perhaps an entire haunch of venison, or an enormous roast beef known as a baron of beef. The meaning of such meat lay not only in eating it, but in displaying it. Its sheer size was itself a declaration, announcing the host's wealth and generosity. In fact, the quantity of food prepared for such a dinner was astonishing. Very often far more was made than the guests could possibly eat, because the leftovers would become the servants' meals. That, too, was part of how this enormous system kept running. You would also notice that the style of cooking was deeply influenced by the French cuisine fashionable at the time. Wealthy families hired French chefs at high salaries, and this was regarded as a mark of sophistication. The presentation of food was as important as its flavor, perhaps even more important. Thus, one dining table, two worlds. In Victorian Britain, the gulf between rich and poor was nowhere more vividly expressed than in food. As you look at these two utterly different tables, you realize that food here has long since gone beyond its primitive function of staving off hunger. For the poor, food is a survival tool calculated in calories, fuel against starvation. Their menu is determined by price, the cheapness of onions, the calories of dripping, the filling quality of household bread. These are their only standards of choice. For the rich, food is a carefully staged drama, a prop used to consolidate and flaunt social position. The names of dishes must be in French, the ingredients must be rare, the portions must be extravagant, all of it performed for the eyes of others. The dining table is not merely a place to eat. It is a mirror, clearly reflecting every person's place in this rigidly stratified society. Now let us leave those two quiet dining rooms and return to the noisy streets of London. It is later now. Workers who have finished a day of exhausting labor are pouring out of factories and joining the flood of people headed home. Their lodgings are cramped. They have no proper kitchens, and sometimes life itself is hard to sustain. So where does their dinner come from? The answer lies in the flowing, lively street. You follow one worker. In his pocket are a few pennies earned through hard labor that day. He is in no hurry to go home. Instead, he begins a kind of mobile feast. This is a distinctive way for Victorian wage earners to find their food, free, casual, full of the everyday vitality of the street. First, you smell the aroma of baked potatoes. On a street corner stands a brightly colored metal canister, heated from below by charcoal, keeping the potatoes inside piping hot. The worker spends 1 penny on one. The vendor deftly cuts it open, spreads on a lump of butter, then sprinkles it with salt and pepper. On a cold, damp London night, this steaming baked potato not only fills the stomach, it also doubles as a hand warmer. He eats as he walks. Soon another smell reaches you, a mix of salty sea air and spice. It comes from a seafood stall displaying all sorts of shellfish, cooked cockles, mussels, snails, and pickled periwinkles. The worker spends another penny on a small portion of shellfish, seasoned with vinegar and pepper. Eating such things requires skill and patience. You need a pin to pick the meat out of the shell. That makes them perfect for nibbling on the move, passing the time on the road home. These street stalls were often strategically placed outside gin shops. That way, workers could buy something to eat and then step inside for a warming glass of ginger beer, or perhaps a drink of cheap sweet wine. Walking on, the choices grow more numerous. From one stall comes the smell of pies, with fillings both savory and sweet, excellent portable food. Another stall sells steaming eel soup or grilled eel. The eel seller shouts loudly, "Hot, fragrant eel." That distinctive aroma always draws a crowd. And if you find these flavors too heavy, the street also offers lighter choices. Vendors selling watercress, a few fresh leaves that can count as a salad, and others selling roasted apples, their sweet tart taste making a perfect dessert. Of course, street food had its own hierarchy of disdain. At the very bottom, perhaps, were sheep's trotters. Originally, sheep's feet were an important raw material for making glue. But as industrial development produced cheaper substitutes, they began to be sold as food to the poorest. For a worker with an extremely limited budget, a baked potato and a boiled sheep's trotter made a pretty decent dinner. Just when you think this moving feast is about to end, you hear a crisp ringing of bells. Looking toward the sound, you see the legendary Muffin Man. He carries a basket covered with thick cloth. Inside are freshly baked muffins and crumpets, still warm with steam. This was an afternoon tea delicacy that crossed class lines. Rich and poor alike loved it. Interestingly, the practice of ringing bells to advertise them had actually been banned by an Act of Parliament in 1839 on the grounds that it disturbed the peace, but evidently both vendors and customers collectively ignored the ban. The bright ring of the bell remained a distinctive part of the London streetscape. In the Victorian age, the urban population exploded, living space became desperately crowded, and most working-class homes had no real cooking facilities. Street food, therefore, became an indispensable part of daily life. As you watch this worker finish the last bite of his muffin and disappear, contented, into the end of an alley, you may suddenly understand that street food for him is not merely nourishment. In that rigid era, with constraints everywhere, this moving feast offered something precious and fleeting: freedom. On the street, there are no complicated table manners, no pressure to spend beyond one's means. According to the few pennies in his pocket, he can choose tonight's menu freely, decide whether to eat his potato first or have his fish soup first. In a life ruled by factory whistles and strict social norms, that power of choice is immensely precious. Here food returns to its purest essence, and the eater, for a moment, casts off the shackles of class and enjoys a brief spell of autonomy and ease. Let us take our eyes away from the varied street foods for a moment and focus on one food that at the time looked utterly unremarkable, yet was everywhere: the oyster. If you could travel back to London in the 1860s, what you saw would shock you. Oysters today, a luxury sold discreetly in high-end restaurants, were then cheaper than potatoes. They were piled in heaps and hawked loudly at every street corner. You did not need to sit down, and you did not even need a plate. The vendor would skillfully pry open the shell with a small knife and hand it to you. You tipped back your head, sucked in the oyster with all its briny freshness, and casually threw the shell onto the ground. Streets at the time were often carpeted with crushed oyster shells. They had become part of the city's accumulated debris. This is no exaggeration. According to records, in 1864, alone Londoners ate around 700 million oysters. Today that number is almost unimaginable. For the urban poor, oysters were a gift from God, one of the cheapest sources of protein available. For a penny, you could buy 4 to 8, enough to make you forget hunger for a while. The great novelist Charles Dickens once wrote that poverty and oysters seemed always to go together. That line captured the reality of the age with precision. And yet, oysters did not belong to the poor alone. They were a rare food able to cross the divide between classes. Prosperous gentlemen on their way to dinner parties would also stop at street stalls to eat a few oysters as an appetizer, much as we might have pre-dinner snacks today. In middle-class kitchens, housewives stuffed cheap oyster meat into meat pies to bulk out the filling and enrich the flavor. It was an economical culinary trick. Whether rich or poor, people were nourished by oysters and by their astonishing abundance in this rapidly swelling city. Part of this easy plenty came from improvements in transport. The expansion of the railways meant oysters could be sent quickly inland from the coast. At the same time, the emergence of canning technology made it possible to preserve oyster meat longer and ship it farther. But beneath this prosperity lurked a grave danger. In Victorian London, the Thames had already become an enormous open sewer. Industrial waste and household sewage were discharged into it untreated. Oysters, as filter-feeding creatures, were like underwater vacuum cleaners, concentrating everything in the river, including deadly pathogens, inside their bodies. Thus, eating oysters at the time was like playing Russian roulette. You might enjoy a delicious meal, or you might swallow the germs of typhoid or cholera along with it. So what caused this once plentiful, cheap delicacy to disappear from the poor man's table and become the luxury item it is today? Some believe the main culprit was overfishing. As demand soared, fishermen began using a new technology called dredging, dragging iron nets along the seabed. It greatly increased efficiency, but also devastated oyster habitats. Other scholars point to worsening industrial pollution as the main cause. Polluted oysters not only endangered health, but also led to a sharp decline in their numbers. A third view holds that oysters declined because they met a powerful competitor. With the rise of refrigerated transport in the 1880s, cheap imported meat from the Americas and Australia flooded the British market, giving people a safer and more stable source of protein. Oysters were gradually displaced. Now let us return once more to that cramped single room in a London slum. This time we will not look at the dinner table, but at the so-called kitchen. Calling it a kitchen is really too generous, because in such homes there was no separate room worthy of that name. The kitchen before your eyes is simply the fireplace in the corner of the room. This fireplace is the center of the whole household. In damp, bitter winters, it provides the only warmth. It also bears the full burden of cooking, heating water, and even drying clothes. Hanging above it is usually an iron pot, often the only cooking utensil the family owns. Whether making vegetable mush, boiling water, or occasionally stewing a small piece of meat, every cooking task falls to that single pot. Look around, and you notice something odd. There is almost no baked food in this house. That is because the vast majority of poor households had no oven at all. The structure of the fireplace meant it could only be used for boiling, stewing, frying, and the like. If housewives wanted bread or baked pies, they had to take prepared dough to the community bakehouse and pay a small fee to have it baked there. This dependence on public facilities also shaped a distinctive kind of community relationship. Much neighborhood conversation took place while waiting for the bread to come out of the oven. Now, look at their pantry. Their storage amounts to a few wooden shelves nailed to the wall, or a crude cupboard. On it are the few ingredients they possess: a sack of brown flour, some potatoes and onions, and a hard cheese wrapped in cloth. In the days before refrigerators, preserving food was the great challenge. That is why the working class preferred hard cheeses, which kept much longer than soft ones. Even the final hard rind, tough as stone, would not be thrown away. Housewives would heat it over the fire to soften it, and then divide it among the children. You may also notice that there is very little milk and butter in their diet. Butter is too expensive, so they substitute cheaper dripping. And milk, even when it can be bought, is often watered down by dishonest milk sellers. Still, many families kept 1 or 2 hens in a tiny backyard. These hens were valuable assets. They could provide as many as a dozen eggs a week, an important source of protein for the family, especially on days when meat was unaffordable. Water was another major problem. There was no running water here. All drinking water had to be fetched from the public pump in the street. Yet the water source for such pumps was often already contaminated by nearby cesspits. Drinking raw water was, therefore, extremely dangerous. That is why, in the Victorian era, people widely believed that drinking weak small beer was safer than drinking water. And children were no exception, because the heating involved in brewing killed most of the bacteria. Now hold your breath and leave that fireplace so full of smoke, warmth, and human feeling. Pass through an invisible door and instantly descend into the basement of an aristocratic mansion. This is the engine room of the whole house, a vast, busy kitchen, governed by strict hierarchy. The first thing you feel is a wave of heat. It comes from the monstrous object at the center of the room. A huge cast iron range, the core of Victorian kitchen technology. It replaced the old open fireplace, was much more efficient, and could roast, boil, stew, and do much else at the same time. But it was also a tyrant. It greedily devoured coal. Servants had to light it at dawn, keep feeding it all day, and clear away the ash in order to maintain a steady temperature. The rhythm of the entire kitchen was determined by the breathing of this iron giant. This kitchen is not a warm domestic space, but a disciplined factory. You see a strict hierarchy operating with efficiency. At the top stands the cook, if the household is particularly rich and refined. He may be a highly paid French male chef. He is responsible for designing the menu and handling the core cooking. He is the absolute ruler of this kingdom. Beneath him are the kitchen maids, who chop vegetables, prepare ingredients, and carry out auxiliary tasks. At the bottom is the scullery maid, usually the youngest and least experienced girl, responsible for the dirtiest and hardest work, washing mountains of pots and pans, scrubbing floors, dealing with kitchen waste. By design, this kitchen is deliberately separated from the family's living quarters. It is usually in the basement or in a separate rear wing, cut off from the main staircase by a thick green baize door. Once the food is ready, it is silently sent upstairs to the dining room by a device called a dumbwaiter. The whole point of the design is to isolate the noise, smell, smoke, and unbecoming physical labor of the kitchen from the elegant, tranquil lives of the household above. Compared with the slum fireplace, the technical equipment here belongs to another world. On the walls hangs row after row of gleaming copper pots, their interiors lined with tin to prevent chemical reactions between the copper and certain foods. On the work tables are all kinds of novel mass-produced industrial kitchen gadgets, cherry pitters, cheese graters, potato peelers, and jelly molds and pastry cutters in all sorts of strange shapes. And of course there is also something familiar to us: canned food. Although tinned foods were already quite common by the mid-19th century, a dedicated can opener was slow to be invented. For a long time, whether one was a cook in a wealthy household or a housewife in an ordinary home, opening a tin required a hammer and chisel, which made for a rather awkward scene. Convenient can openers did not begin to spread widely in kitchens until the 1870s. And when you observe this efficiently run kitchen, you notice how strikingly similar it is to the Industrial Revolution itself. The huge range is the kitchen's steam engine. The servants are workers on an assembly line. Each person has a clearly defined task, all directed toward the efficient production of one elegant meal after another. The physical separation between kitchen and dining room, together with that dumbwaiter, conceals a deep social psychology, the invisibilization of labor. The graceful, leisurely, seemingly effortless dinner upstairs is a carefully constructed illusion. That illusion depends precisely on hiding the vast, heavy, and at times dirty labor process behind it. Wealthy Victorians enjoyed the fruits of the Industrial Revolution, but did not wish to see the factories and workers producing them. Likewise, they enjoyed exquisite food, but did not wish to see the kitchens and servants producing it. This separation of consumption from production, of enjoyment from labor, was a core feature of the capitalism and class rigidity of the age. What we are going to talk about next is not fine cuisine, but a shocking secret hidden in everyday Victorian food. A vast and horrifying food adulteration scandal that touched the entire population. Imagine yourself walking into a Victorian grocer's shop. Pod eye. The shelves are stacked with attractive goods. You buy a pound of white bread, planning to make sandwiches at home. What you do not know is that, to make the bread look whiter and weigh more, the baker has mixed alum into the flour, perhaps even plaster. Alum is not highly toxic in itself, but it inhibits digestion and drastically reduces the nutritional value of the other food you eat. Then you buy your children some brightly colored sweets. Their vivid reds, greens, and yellows look irresistible. But you do not know that those colors come from poisonous chemical pigments. The red may come from mercuric sulfide, the yellow from lead chromate, and the green from copper acetate containing arsenate. Every sweet the children eat is in effect a small dose of poison. You buy a jar of mustard, but there are very few real mustard seeds in it. Most of it is flour colored with turmeric, and to make it yellower still, lead chromate may have been added. You buy a jar of pickled cucumbers whose vivid green comes from copper sulfate. The milk you buy has been watered down, and to make it look thick again, chalk powder or even animal brains have been added. The beer you drink has poisonous strychnine added to increase its bitterness. Even the tea leaves you brew are likely to be used tea leaves that have been collected, dried, and dyed again with Prussian blue or graphite before being resolved. The list goes on, like the shopping list of a mad chemist. This is not alarmism. It was the daily reality faced by Britons in the Victorian period. Food adulteration had become all-pervasive. So how was this dreadful secret exposed? Here we must remember the name of a hero, Dr. Arthur Hill Hassall. In the early 1850s, the famous medical journal, The Lancet, commissioned Dr. Hassall to conduct an unprecedented investigation. His weapon was the microscope, a piece of equipment that counted as high technology at the time. He randomly bought thousands of food samples from shops all over London and examined them one by one under the microscope. He saw plaster crystals in bread, strange dyed particles in tea leaves, and roasted chicory and other foreign matter mixed into ground coffee. By means of chemical analysis, he identified heavy metals in sweets and pickles. From 1851 to 1854, The Lancet published Dr. Hassall's investigation reports in succession, and it made an extremely bold decision for the time. It directly published the names and addresses of the merchants selling these adulterated foods. The reports caused an enormous public uproar. For the first time, the public could clearly see what it was actually putting into its mouth every day. Under immense public pressure, Parliament finally acted. In 1860, Britain passed its first Food Adulteration Act. Although the penalties were weak at first, it opened the way for regulating food safety by law. Owing to a report by a London sanitary officer at the time, an ice cream sample bought from a street vendor was found to contain not only huge quantities of bacteria, but also straw, human hair, and the hair of cats and dogs, along with various insects and insect parts. Ice cream of this kind was an important vector for diseases such as diphtheria and scarlet fever. As for the roots of this scandal, some argue that it was mainly the work of morally corrupt bad actors willing to do anything for profit. But other scholars, particularly historians influenced by Marx and Engels, argue that it was a systemic problem. In a laissez-faire capitalist market after the Industrial Revolution, they say, fierce competition inevitably drove merchants to cut costs and increase profit by every possible means. Food adulteration was the inevitable product of that ruthless logic, a stark example of the bourgeoisie sacrificing working-class lives for profit. This scandal revealed a crisis deeper than food itself, a crisis of trust. In a pre-industrial village, you knew the baker who made your bread and the farmer who milked your cow. Human relationships themselves provided a guarantee of quality. But in the anonymous industrial city, you bought goods from merchants you did not know, produced in factories you could not see. This separation between producer and consumer created fertile ground for fraud and adulteration. Dr. Hassall's greatness lay in his use of a new tool to rebuild that trust. His microscope was like a pair of sharp eyes, piercing the lies of dishonest merchants and allowing ordinary consumers to see the truth of food for themselves. It marked a transfer of power. Scientific evidence, for the first time, became a weapon ordinary people could use against commercial fraud. It proclaimed the arrival of a new age in a complex, anonymous modern society. Transparency and regulation would have to be enforced by science and law. Dr. Hassel's microscope illuminated not only the impurities in food, but also the road ahead for the modern consumer society. Now let us leave the laboratory and return to the energetic heart of London. We are going to visit the city's great food hubs, the wholesale markets. We are going to smell two of the most famous of them, Smithfield Meat Market and Billingsgate Fish Market. First, Smithfield. Before the middle of the 19th century, this was London's main live cattle market. Imagine the scene: thousands upon thousands of cattle, sheep, and pigs driven through London's narrow, crowded streets, eventually converging in a market covering only 5 acres. The air was full of the smell of animal dung, blood, and the cries of terrified beasts. The streets were muddy, chaotic, and deafening. For city authorities and residents alike, it was a major sanitary and traffic nightmare. So, in the Victorian era, a major transformation took place. The live market was moved out to the suburbs, and Old Smithfield was rebuilt as a modern new market. Entering it, your senses are immediately overwhelmed. First comes the visual shock. Under the vast glass roof hang whole carcasses of pigs, cattle, and sheep, from row upon row of iron hooks, forming a seemingly endless forest of meat. Workers in blood-stained white aprons carry heavy sides of meat through the crowds. The floor is always wet, slick with a mixture of blood and wash water. Then comes the smell, the powerful scent of raw flesh, primitive and intense, almost visceral. Finally comes the sound, the dull thud of butchers cleaving meat with huge knives, the loud haggling between buyers and sellers, and the rattle of cart wheels over the paving stones, all woven together into a symphony of the market. It is a place full of masculine force, a world dominated almost entirely by men. Now, let us leave inland London and head down the Thames to Billingsgate Fish Market. If Smithfield smelled strongly of blood and raw meat, Billingsgate smelled sharply of salt. It was then the largest fish market in the world, every day before dawn. Fishing boats heavy with all kinds of seafood came to shore, and the air filled with the mixed scents of seawater, fish scales, and mud from the riverbank. The spectacle was equally grand. Salmon, cod, flying fish, plaice, piled high, along with countless shellfish and eels. The market's trading method was distinctive. A Dutch auction, beginning at a high price and calling downward until the first bidder accepted. This fast-paced system demanded intense concentration from the buyers. Yet Billingsgate may have been even more famous for something other than fish, its fishwives. These women who worked in the market were known throughout Britain for their booming voices and their rough, bold language. Their cries, their banter with customers, and their arguments with one another formed a unique market culture. When you stand in the middle of these two markets, you are struck by their raw vitality. There is none of the false politeness of an upstairs dinner party, nor the piecemeal improvisation of the street hawker. Here food appears in its most original, most large-scale form. These markets are not merely places of trade. They are the urban theater of Victorian London. Here people of different classes gather and collide in pursuit of the same goal. Smithfield's 24-hour cycle witnessed train drivers arriving in the night, butchers beginning work before dawn, white-collar workers hurrying in the morning, and tourists visiting during the day. Their life paths crossed briefly in this one space. These markets were like the city's unvarnished, living entrails, revealing London at its most real, deepest, and most dramatic. Now that we have left behind the noise of the markets, let us go somewhere quiet and elegant, scented with baked cakes and black tea. The story of afternoon tea centers on a woman named Anna Russell, Duchess of Bedford. The time is around 1840, in the upper reaches of British society. The rhythm of life was undergoing a subtle but important change. As gas lighting spread through cities, nightlife grew ever richer, and dinner was pushed later, and later, often not beginning until 8 or even 9 in the evening. This created a modest but genuine problem for the Duchess. Lunch was generally eaten at noon, while dinner did not begin until 8 or 9, leaving a gap of 7 or 8 hours. By 4 or 5 in the afternoon, she would feel what she called that sinking feeling, a vivid expression for the fatigue and emptiness caused by hunger. So one day, she instructed her servants to bring a tea tray to her room. On the tray were a steaming pot of black tea, a few slices of bread and butter, and 1 or 2 small cakes. This simple little meal perfectly filled the difficult hours of the afternoon. The Duchess quickly fell in love with the habit and began inviting her close female friends to share it with her. In a private, female-only space, they drank tea, ate pastries, and chatted at ease. As a lady of the bedchamber to Queen Victoria and a central figure in London society, the Duchess's new pastime quickly spread among aristocratic women and became a fashionable social activity. Gradually, afternoon tea developed a fixed form, the most classic being the 3-tiered stand. By tradition, you should eat from the bottom upward. On the bottom tier are savory finger sandwiches, often filled with cucumber, egg, smoked salmon, and the like. The middle tier holds the soul of English afternoon tea. Scones, served with clotted cream and strawberry jam. The top tier is reserved for delicate little cakes and sweets. And speaking of afternoon tea, one cannot avoid speaking of Victorian British drink culture. We are about to visit 2 utterly opposed worlds. On one side, the brilliantly lit, noisy gin palace. On the other, the solemn atmosphere of the temperance meeting. First we push open an ornate door and enter a gin palace. The sight is immediately overwhelming. Huge gas chandeliers make the room as bright as day. The bar is made of expensive mahogany. Giant mirrors line the walls, making the whole space look broader and more dreamlike. The air is heavy with the sorrowful smell of cheap gin, tobacco, and sweat. Behind the counter, the barman pours drinks at speed. Gin, what people often simply called drink, was the poor man's water of forgetfulness. In the 18th century, London had experienced a terrible gin craze that nearly destroyed a generation. By the Victorian era, the situation had improved somewhat. But in poor industrial districts, alcoholism was still a grave problem. For people trapped in harsh conditions and exhausting, monotonous labor, alcohol was the fastest and cheapest means of escaping reality. But that escape often came at a terrible cost. Countless families were plunged into destitution because the husband spent his wages on drink, and rates of domestic violence and crime remained high. And so a major social movement emerged, determined to pull people out of the gin palaces. The temperance movement. Temperance campaigners understood that preaching alone was not enough. They had to offer an attractive alternative, so they came up with a distinctly British solution. Large, free tea gatherings. In temperance halls, they set out long tables piled high with free bread, cakes, and fruit, along with huge teapots providing unlimited cups of hot tea. Their message was clear: use the warmth and clarity of tea to oppose the intoxication and destruction of gin. They even opened temperance bars and temperance billiard halls, providing all the entertainments of a public house, only replacing alcoholic drinks with soda or herbal beverages. This shows that, in an age when consumer society was just beginning to emerge, people had already dimly realized something crucial. If you want to change mass behavior, moral condemnation alone is nowhere near enough. You must offer something on the market that is just as attractive, or even more attractive. This war to save the soul of the nation was ultimately fought on the battlefield of consumer choice. And on the Victorian table, besides the serious main courses, there was another kind of food that brought a touch of brightness to this rather rigid age through its strange forms and trembling textures. This was the Victorian near obsession with jellies and puddings. First, jelly. You may think jelly is nothing unusual, but in the Victorian period it was one of the most dazzling desserts at a dinner party. This craze, too, was a product of the Industrial Revolution. Two technological developments together created it. The appearance of cheap factory-made gelatin, and advances in manufacturing that made it possible to stamp copper sheets under great pressure into intricate and elegant molds. Victorian cooks therefore launched themselves into a mad competition in edible architecture. The jelly molds they used were more complex than you can imagine. Some were shaped like Gothic churches, others like pineapples. More astonishing still, they invented multi-part molds with internal components. One type had a hollow inner liner. The cook first poured a layer of clear jelly between the outer mold and the liner. Once it set, the liner was removed, leaving a hollow cavity inside the jelly. Into this cavity they placed small pieces of brightly colored fruit, then sealed it with more jelly. The result was a crystal-clear jelly within which floated a dazzling mosaic-like pattern made of fruit. There were even more complicated examples. Some molds could produce jellies with internal designs, such as the cross of the Danish flag or the star of the Order of the Garter. Rather like the Japanese hard candy Kentaro Ame, the pattern remained intact wherever you sliced it. These trembling, glittering, structurally elaborate desserts were the ultimate display of a host's wealth and a cook's skill. Next, pudding. For non-British people, the word often causes confusion. In Britain, it has a very broad meaning and can refer to almost any dessert. But at the same time, pudding can also refer specifically to a class of foods made by steaming or boiling, and they may be either sweet or savory. Classic sweet pudding is the famous spotted dick. It is made by mixing suet, flour, milk, and dried fruit, then steaming the mixture in a pudding basin. It is usually served with custard. A classic savory pudding, on the other hand, is steak and kidney pudding. Its outer crust is likewise made from suet and flour, but inside are cubes of beef steak, beef kidney, and rich gravy. After a long steaming, the crust absorbs the essence of the meat juices and becomes soft and delicious, while the meat inside turns tender and full of flavor. And alongside jelly and pudding, there was another highly representative food, curry. Curry was not native to Britain. It came from the distant colony of India. As increasing numbers of British officials, soldiers, and merchants working in India returned home, they also brought back their love of these spicy, fragrant Indian seasonings. Before long, eating curry became fashionable in Britain itself. Especially after Queen Victoria was given the title Empress of India, this exotic atmosphere associated with imperial glory became even more admired by high society. But the British did not adopt curry wholesale. They adapted it to their own tastes and cooking habits, thereby creating a distinctive Anglo-Indian cuisine. On menus of the time, you can see some curious new dishes. One is mulligatawny soup. The word comes from Tamil in South India and originally meant pepper water, a spicy broth. But the British felt that an Indian meal without a soup course was somehow incomplete. So they invented this soup as an appetizer for the British-style formal meal. They reduced the heat, added chicken stock, cream, and even apple, making it thicker, milder, and more suited to British tastes. Another famous Anglo-Indian dish is khichdi for breakfast. This breakfast dish combines smoked haddock, rice, boiled eggs, and curry powder. Its prototype may have been khichdi, an Indian porridge made of rice and lentils. But the British added the smoked fish and butter they loved, turning it into a hearty English breakfast dish with an exotic flavor. For the ordinary middle-class housewife, curry powder also had a very practical function. In the days before refrigeration, what to do with the leftovers from Sunday's roast was a problem. Spicy curry powder could conveniently disguise the taste of meat that was no longer entirely fresh and give it a whole new character. Thus, curried leftovers became a fixed Monday dish in many households. Besides curry, several other things we now think of as familiar British staples also emerged under the imperial background. Worcestershire sauce, for example, is said to have been invented accidentally by two chemists trying to recreate a sauce they had tasted in India. And the classic gin and tonic was the invention of British officers stationed in India. To prevent malaria, they had to take quinine, but quinine was extremely bitter. To make it easier to swallow, they mixed it with gin, soda water, and lemon, accidentally creating a classic cocktail that survives to this day. Well then, my friend, our journey through Victorian food is drawing to an end. We have seen the poor man's vegetable mush and the rich man's turtle soup, wandered through noisy streets and markets, and witnessed the birth of afternoon tea and the revolution in the food industry. In this final chapter, let us return to the present and see what deep echoes the Victorian table has left on our plates today. You may be surprised to discover that many food traditions we now take for granted as quintessentially British are rooted deep in Victorian soil. Take the modern British Christmas dinner. The celebration of Christmas itself is ancient, of course, but the Christmas scene we know today, a tree decorated with lights and, at the center of the table, roast turkey or roast goose, was to a large extent fixed in the Victorian era. This was thanks to Queen Victoria and her German husband, Prince Albert, who brought the German Christmas tree tradition into the British royal household. And the great novelist Charles Dickens, through A Christmas Carol, turned the abundant Christmas dinner into a symbol of family reunion and charitable spirit, lodging it in the public imagination. Or consider the Sunday roast, although the history of roasted meat goes further back. In the Victorian age, with the growth of the middle class and the falling price of meat, the custom of the whole family gathering on Sunday to eat a roast dinner with Yorkshire pudding, roast potatoes, and gravy gradually became a fixed and emblematic family ritual. Then there is Britain's national dish, fish and chips. In the Victorian era, fried fish and fried potatoes existed separately as two kinds of street food. It was not until the late 19th century that someone first put them together and sold them as one. This simple but brilliant combination rapidly won the affection of the working class and eventually became one of the foods most representative of Britain. Not to mention the classic desserts that we still enjoy today. The Victoria sponge named after the Queen, the Battenberg cake with its neat checkered pattern, and the sickly sweet yet irresistible treacle tart. All of these are products of Victorian baking. Looking back, thus the overall legacy of the Victorian era for British food, positive or negative? One view holds that the Victorian age was a disastrous period for British cuisine. Urbanization driven by industrialization detached people from the land and made them rely on standardized, factory-produced, and sometimes adulterated food. The pursuit of efficiency, the craving for convenience, and the rigid, dull tastes of the middle class together led to the decline of traditional British culinary skills and eventually produced the monotonous, dull, hopeless international image of British food. But another view argues that the Victorian age was in fact the foundation-laying era of modern British cuisine. It was an age full of innovation and fusion. New technologies, railways, and tinning brought previously unimaginable ingredients. Imperial expansion brought flavors from around the world, and popularizers such as Mrs. Beeton spread culinary knowledge to many more people through standardized recipes. Seen from this angle, the Victorian age did not ruin British food at all. On the contrary, it laid the solid groundwork for its later diversification. When you finish this long culinary journey, you may realize that the people of the Victorian age were in fact the first generation of modern eaters. They were the first to consume branded, industrialized, globalized food on a large scale. They were the first to feel anxiety about food safety and additives. They were the first to taste, on the same table, flavors from home, from the colonies, and from all over the world. They were also the first to divide the act of eating into so many complex social functions. Many of the confusions, anxieties, and choices we face around food, today organic versus processed, local versus global, health versus convenience, the social meaning of food, all these questions have their seeds buried in that distant, yet strangely familiar Victorian age. The stories on their plates are still sending melancholy echoes across our own.